Okay, so let's see here. Okay, can you hear me back there, Charles? Okay, so I want to thank Tiziano and Jan for organizing a great conference. I'm sure we're all learning a lot. We'll continue to do that. And also thank Jan for, we sat together last night at dinner, and he during the conversation, he reminded me that his first conference here at the university was the monuments of Minos, and Jan's retiring, I guess, next semester. And he's organized at least a dozen of the past 24 or so years. And they've all been fascinating and quickly published, so I'm sure this one will be. But I think we all want to congratulate Jan on just a great, corpus of conferences and things. It's really been a blast. I've been to about 5 of them, I think. So I also want to thank Vili and Chrysa, who direct the project in different phases. It's now Chryssi Sofianou, for inviting all of us to work with them on the study and publication of this material. So previous attempts to trace the relative chronology of the Theran eruption at East Cretan settlements can best be described as preliminary. Much of the problem stems from site formation processes, which have preserved LM1B destruction deposits and removed or redeposited earlier MM3B and LM1A material. Recent excavations at Moklos and Papadiokombos, you see them here at the top of the map, provide some good illustrations. Large houses at both sites contain substantial primary destruction deposits from the end of LM1B. A single dwelling like House C3 that you see here at Moklos contained more than 100 complete phases, or with full profiles. Usually very fragmentary and often in construction fills. And for this particular house, you can go now and see Jeff Soul's recent publication in Moklos 4A. In a few cases, for example, House C1 that you see here, deposits of Theran ash were found in association with this rebuilding, suggesting that these settlements were damaged during the eruption at the end of LM1A and rebuilt early in LM1B. Because of publication strategies favoring primary deposits of complete vessels, these earlier MM3B LM1A deposits are rarely studied in the same detail as the final LM1B levels. Moreover, their mixed nature detects subtle changes that are crucial to building a relative ceramic sequence. Our presentation today takes a fresh look at the problem, drawing on material from 3 neopalatial buildings you see here, recently excavated by the Laciti effort on Chryssi, under Vili Apostolakou from 2008 to 2009, and now Chryssi Sofianou from 2015 to present. All 3 structures contain well-preserved LM1B destruction deposits, like those found in the houses at Moklos and Papadiokombos. The buildings also contain MM3B, LM1A, and early LM1B material, again, primarily in secondary deposits. Careful Chryssi deposits has, however, revealed a very different local taphonomy. Unlike the 2 to 3 story rubble houses typical of East Cretan LM1 settlements, dwellings on Chryssi were in most cases just 1 story. This was probably not a matter of taste, but instead the result of limited building materials on the island in the absence of hill slopes. These simpler designs you see here required less excavation during construction, resulting in less damage and mixing of earlier deposits. While there is evidence for frequent rebuilding during the Neopalatial period, these processes often involve the addition or abandonment of rooms rather than digging deep new foundations. These primary and relatively clean sites from Chryssi thus appear to offer a better illustration of the earlier Neopalatial phases than sites like Gornia or Moklos. Our paper draws particular attention to the cups from LM1A and LM1B phases, so bottoms up, as they represent the most abundant vessel type, which are also the most sensitive to changes in decoration, shape, and manufacturing techniques. Excavation on Chryssi has also recovered interesting evidence for the eruption itself. The first feature is a layer of fine ash beneath spaces in buildings B2, A2 you see on the left, B2 on the right. And the ash layers are marked in red. This ash is spread over large areas and does not appear to be the result of routine activity like cooking, for example. What is particularly interesting for this conference is the fact that it consistently sits below LM1B floors in architecture, and occasionally, for example, in trench B800 or B1400, above LM1A material. Is it airborne tephra, or part of a widespread destruction layer, perhaps caused by the eruption, or an anthropogenic feature, for example, the result of widespread burning of organic material as part of the cleanup or repair of the site after the eruption. We collected several samples for micromorphology analysis in house A2 on the left and one more in house B2 you see on the right to help answer this question. While complementary, the results also defy a simple explanation. From the 3 micromorphology samples in ashy areas, Takis Karkanes of the Wiener Laboratory notes the presence of tephra mixed with burned ash in room 1 of A2, you see that on the upper left, and the court immediately to the east. No tephra, however, was found in the ash layer in room 3 of B2, you see at the lower left. Phytolith analysis of 18 samples by Georgia Sartsivu again identified large amounts of tephra layers as the micromorphology samples. That would be room 1 of A2 and the court just to the east. But just trace amounts of tephra in room 3 of B2 at the lower left. The phytoliths, however, help identify other possible non-volcanic sources of ash in these deposits. The phytoliths from room 1 of A2 attest to the presence of cereals, which were probably processed in this kitchen. The phytoliths from food and grass plants were found in the court next door. They may have been fuel or part of a cover over the court. The phytoliths in room 3 of B2, here at the lower left, were full of reed and possible cereals. And Georgia thinks it might have been for baskets for the storage of food, or again, from roofing material that burned. Next summer, we will collect more samples from the rooms in the southeast corner of B2, which would be the spaces you see on the right, to study this mix of materials to unlock the mystery of the tephra mixed with ash. Already, the preliminary results suggest that the ash layers consist of reworked material beneath new constructions in LM1B. And for anyone who's heard the detailed reports of the tsunami from Cheshme by Vasip Sohoglu, or read the final publication about the tephra deposits in Building 6 at Palekastro, the complexity of these new finds on Chryssi should not be surprising. And again, as Jan pointed out in his recent article, the tephra at Chryssi, Takis thinks it's been reworked with water. Again, we found similar things at tephra on Papatheokombos on the north coast of Crete. So it may also be worth taking a fresh look at the tephra layers recorded at sites like Moklos, which was just republished by Jeff Souls, and again, Papatheokombos, where again, Floyd McCoy thought that in a layer of about 16 centimeters of tephra, only the bottom sort of centimeter or 2 was in primary position, and the rest had been reworked, probably brought down slope with rain or again with water. So excavation in trench B2600, B2, you see here at the upper right, revealed additional remains of the eruption beneath 2 unusual strata of faunal material. Intensive soil samples from a layer beneath the stratum of black ash, that's the late blue layer at the bottom, contained large amounts of fish bones and many tiny pieces of pumice, which you see in photographs. But those, again, look at the scale of those photographs, it's millimeters. And these pumice grains were like fine grains of sand. To give you some idea of how unique this find was, our flotation analyst had processed more than 1,000 soil samples from Chryssi in 10 years. And this was the botanist later reported finding smaller amounts of the same grain-sized pumice in the soil samples from the ash deposits in A2, where micromorphology and phytoliths had already identified tephra as well. So Floyd McCoy, who hasn't seen this material in person because of the pandemic, but who wonders if the pumice sand might represent a rare form of airborne pumice that landed on Chryssi shortly before the eruption, but this needs to be studied in detail. It's just a comment, really. So an argument also will be made later in the paper that the pottery from the layer of fish, which is that layer of black soil you see in the second, should be dated to early LM1B. So formation processes in the settlement at Chryssi. We now would like to take a closer look at the taphonomy of the pottery deposits from the 4 subphases of the Neopalatial period spanning MM3B to LM1B. Recent studies have shown that the site of Pharos, that's its name for the site that has a small lighthouse on it, was inhabited continuously from Middle Minoan 1B, so the beginning of the Protopalatial period, and from Middle Minoan 1B to 2B, this settlement was there largely to exploit the rich shellfish population to make purple dye, and that's been the focus of most of our studies. The same studies also recorded Middle Minoan 3A material in rooms near the lighthouse, suggesting perhaps limited activity at the beginning of the Neopalatial period. Things seem to pick up at the beginning of MM3B with a pair of secondary deposits that are south of the lighthouse you see right at the middle of the site. And then later in the LM1A period, several buildings that you see here, like A2 on the lower left, B1 at the upper right, and B2 were constructed. And these are just the three that have been completely excavated, let's say, or almost excavated. There are parts of 2 or 3 more, but we think there might be a dozen or more of these houses at the site. So, building B1, which appears, this was that building on the upper right, which appears to be a unique workshop for making purple dye, has now been completely excavated and provides a clear illustration of the subsequent habitation phases at the site. In LM1A, which is the plan you see here, B1 included 7 rooms or spaces with floor surfaces, none preserving intact vessels, and 4 secondary deposits of LM1A material in rooms 6, 9, 10, and 15. The material from these fills, particularly rooms 6 and 10, was particularly impressive, and it will be examined later as a sample, I think the best sample of mature LM1A. So right before the eruption, you see 2 of the pieces here. At some point in LM1B early, building B1 is remodeled and along the following plan. These 7 spaces were in gray, were not used in the final phase of LM1B, and they thus provide a limited illustration of the pottery being used earlier in the LM1B phase. A better illustration of early LM1B can be found in trench B2600. Here, excavation recovered remains of an unusual deposit placed in a pit in the collapse of an LM1A room with a possible staircase. At the bottom of this pit lay a hard, burned surface where the soil samples contain those tiny fragments of pumice mentioned earlier. Above this layer was a thick deposit of ashy soil you see here in black, containing lots of decorated pottery and one of the richest deposits of fish ever found from the Late Bronze Age Aegean. This was covered with another hard layer of soil, above which lay another deposit of restorable pottery and the remains of 3 or 4 sheep or goat butchered in large pieces, somewhat unusually. The pottery from both layers, the goat layer and the fish layer, is LM1B, but that of the lower layer lacks many of the features seen in final 1B deposits in houses A2 and B1. In our paper, we'll make the case that it represents a uniquely robust illustration of early LM1B, and you see a piece there. So we begin with the MM3B drinking vessels, which include straight-sided and semiglobular forms, straight-sided on the left, semiglobular on the right. Vafio cups, which will be a feature of the paper, they appear in our mature LM1A deposits. They're absent from this phase, so there are no Vafio cups in these earlier strata. The straight-sided cups appear in plain versions. You see those on the left, some with interior monochrome and an exterior rim band, others with monochrome decoration in and out, light on dark decoration and pattern decoration, particularly tortoiseshell ripple. There are also cylindrical versions with beveled bases, you see at the lower left, decorated with monochrome inside and out, or pattern decoration again like tortoiseshell ripple. From other deposits, we find examples with white on dark spirals, and the semiglobular cups that you see on the right primarily have tortoiseshell ripple on the exterior, and it makes them difficult to distinguish, particularly in these fragmentary forms. There are 2 forms of bowls in these deposits, in and out bowls on the left, which often have tortoiseshell ripple on the outside, and hemispherical bowls you see on the right, which have monochrome inside and out or bands inside and out. Finally, there are no true conical cups in these MM3B levels. Okay. Now, in a few other deposits at Chryssi, this material is also found with pattern decoration, usually with highly polished surfaces. In deposit B930, straight-sided cups, again, appear with monochrome inside and out. You see those at the upper left, or with pattern decoration like crocuses. Other cups again appear with monochrome inside and out, or tortoiseshell ripple on the exterior. You see those in the middle, and often with banding or banding on the interior, or complex decoration like foliate bands below spirals. And the in and out bowls in this deposit again have tortoiseshell ripple on the outside and banding on the interior. Okay. So that was it for MM3B. Now we go to the mature LM1A levels, which I think are a particular feature for this presentation. And the best illustration for this pottery again is found in the fills beneath a final LM1B surface in room 6 of B1 and beneath an early LM1B surface in room 10 of B1. And then finally from the lower LM1 levels of house B2. Here, presumably right after the eruption, right before the eruption, we again see large numbers of straight-sided and semiglobular cups, and conical cups make their first appearance in small and tall forms. And the first ogival cups make their appearance, but these become much more popular in LM1B. So beginning with the straight-sided cups, several are plain. You see those on the pottery will be familiar with that. Those were very common in Middle Minoan 2 and 3. Pattern decoration includes some tortoiseshell ripple, which was much more popular in MM3B. Foliate bands, often in different orientations. This is when we see those diagonal foliate bands of such. Ivy and scroll, but the hallmark are these very delicate, carefully drawn spirals, running spirals. Almost all of the decorated cups have monochrome interiors, like that of MM3B, and in contrast, band to bands, which become much more popular in LM1B. Okay. Now, from houses at B1 and B2, there are also a small number of Vafio cups, some with added red, which are not commonly seen at sites on the isthmus. So the isthmus here being the corridor, the isthmus of Arapatra, so sites like Gornia, Moklos, Papadiokoumos. They exhibit a range of motifs you can see here. But again, the carefully executed spirals are the most common, with close parallels at LM1A Knossos, for example, Popham's little spiral painter you see on the upper right, and LM1A Palekastro, and there's an example from Itanos. We saw an example in the paper earlier. LM1A semiglobular cups share similar decoration with monochrome, tortoiseshell ripple, and running spirals. The deposit also contains a few, and these are on the upper right, examples with hollow or solid centered spirals that are associated with LM1A production at Myrtos, the hollow centered, or Gornia, the solid centered, often with little added white dots. I think we saw one of those as well. Others have delicate running spirals. You see those on the lower right, as we saw in the straight-sided cups. So now we turn to the decorated bowls, and on Chryssi, bowls with in and out decoration, again, typically in this period, there aren't that many, but they have tortoiseshell ripple again on the exterior and wavy bands or interior floral motifs. An exceptional bowl on the right has a reed pattern on the interior. There are also good parallels for Myrtos Pyrgos, where it's likely these bowls were made. Similar examples have been found also at LM1A levels at Bramina, a farmstead that was just published by the Instep Press. Now, the LM1A deposits in room 6 and 10 also contained a significant number of conical cups, which make up 26% of the deposit. The profiles are more open than those that follow in LM1B and have a little ledge rim, but you see the variation. I think the characteristic is this open shape. The rims go out. Finally, on your right, you see ogival cups making their first appearance in very small numbers, less than 3% of the cups. Some are plain at the lower right, and a few are monochrome. And you'll see why that's significant here in the second and the early 1B levels. So now we make the case for early LM1B, and I think this is the most challenging part of the paper. And we do that with a deposit recovered in 2600 that I've mentioned before. This layer right above it's the ashy soil above the layer with the pumice. Now, to characterize the early LM1B deposit, conical and similar globular cups continue in the same percentages as mature LM1A, but the number of straight-sided cups drops sharply, while the number of ogival cups increases. So there are real changes in shape in this deposit. There are also changes in decoration, including the disappearance of tortoiseshell ripple, the evolution of the foliate band design, which takes on a more static horizontal form, The running spirals continue, but only in these simple, single, elegant forms, none of those more complex spirals we saw in LM1A. And frequently in this period, you'll see them bordered by wavy bands, like the one you see here. Added red, which appeared on closed vessels and Vafio cups in LM1A, continues in small amounts on semiglobular cups, while an increase in the use of added white is noticeable. And you'll see it both as accents. Here you see them little slashes on the rim, but you'll see them also on some ogival cups here in a second. So added white is definitely a feature of this early 1B. So taking a closer look, we begin with the semiglobular cups, which are decorated with delicate running spirals, sometimes outlined with thin wavy bands or large foliate bands. You see some on the right, upper right. More cups now appear with banded interiors. Some also have added white. As you can see, there's much more of that now. The conical cups continue. They represent 32% of the assemblage, and they appear in two forms. So it's tightening up here, both an outturned or an incurving rim. You see the outturn on the left, the incurving in the middle. A few plain examples have one handle and are decorated with spirals, and you see another with reed on the upper right. That's unusual. These are the stars of the show. The ogival cups, which increase in number, are made in the same fabric as the conical cups. A smaller version you see here on the left has a very narrow base in contrast to a larger version, which you see on the right. And that larger version has been reduced. They really are much bigger than those on the left. Some of the larger ones already have knob handles, which is interesting. Among the most interesting, however, are the group decorated with monochrome in and out, with added white lines and slashes. There's considerable variation in the profile, and while some are straight, others have a very tight. So take a good look at those shapes on the right. Those are very unusual. Not very many parallels for them. Finally, there are a few bowls with horizontal handles, some of which go above the rim and are grooved and are decorated with spirals or wavy, and these wavy bands again, and they often have banded interiors. So this is an important feature of this deposit. I also want to emphasize and illustrate a few fragments of the semiglobular cups with closed spirals, remember Gornia, or Vafio cups with a rib and spirals, which were features of the mature LM1A. In this deposit, there are only a few fragments, and they're found in the very lowest level with the tephra. So there you get a marker from those mature LM1A deposits that's not a feature of this, and it's found only at the very bottom, okay? So finally, we can take a brief look at the mature or final LM1B deposits. In this phase, conical, ogival, and semiglobular cups design, and there's really a tightening of the shapes. The conical cups, which you see here, now make up 55% of the assemblages with a much more consistent profile and an incurving rim. Ogival cups make up 19 or 20% of the assemblages. There are a few monochrome examples. You see a couple in the middle on the right and left, but most are plain. And they have a much more consistent shape in this period. Semiglobular cups, which make up 25% of these final LM1B shapes, have a much more rounded profile. And running spirals are common, but the most common motif is a crocus pattern, a stylized crocus you see up on the right, the two cups on the upper right. And that crocus pattern is found on many of the closed vessels from this period. So it's really the hallmark that we find the spirals, but I illustrated them in much larger numbers. The much more common feature of final 1B at the site are these cups on the upper right. And you see that marine style job at the lower right. Finally, there's a small number of new cup shapes, including decorated conical cups with a ledge rim, you see at the upper left, bell cups on the right, some with pinched spouts, pedestal cups, there was one in the previous slide, and large bowls with horizontal handles. And you can see here on these cups and how well preserved they are, this is the common decoration of the final phase at the site. And there's only a handful of things with special palatial tradition. I think we have less than 5 pieces of marine style from the whole site. So here, let's go for a summary of the Neopalatial pottery. Having shown the data, I'd like to highlight what appear to be significant changes in both shape and decoration on the cups from Chryssi from Middle Minoan 3B to LM1B final. This chart shows our statistical analysis of the cups, highlighting sort of specific deposits, the best deposits from each phase. So straight-sided cups form nearly, if you look at the left-hand column, 75% of the total in MM2 in MM3B, and that mix of 3B and 1A, that drops to 30% and includes the Vafio cups in LM1A. And then once you go into LM1B, they're insignificant. They don't exist. Semiglobular cups, the next column, in contrast, make up 20 to 35% of the assemblages in nearly all the phases. And on Chryssi, conical cups in the middle begin to appear in mature LM1A, and they become the more dominant shape by the time you get to 1B in that phase. And last, in patterns repeated both at Mauclas and other sites in East Crete, the ogival cup, very small numbers at the end of LM1A, becoming sort of 20 to 25% of the deposits in LM1B. So it really becomes a feature of the site. Turning to decoration, similar patterns are observed. While tortoiseshell ripple and in and out decoration, the first two columns, are noticeable in MM3B, LM1A, they form just a minor part of LM1A, mature, before disappearing completely in LM1B. While monochrome interiors are favored through LM1A mature, banding becomes much more popular in LM1B, particularly in final LM1B. And then we've got, while hollow-centered spirals are found at small numbers in MM3B and LM1A, along with solid-centered spirals, more common at sites on the north coast. Amelia Otto has drawn a lot of attention to this. They disappear in LM1B. And so the hallmark of LM1B, mature and early LM1B, are these decorated cups with these smaller, carefully executed running spirals that continue to be found in small numbers even through LM1B final. And then the small number of organic, floral, and vegetal motifs found in LM1A, they become much more static in LM1B, and you see that trend already in the early 1B phases. So turning to conclusions. To conclude, these Chryssi deposits offer a new and unique view into pottery circulating in Southeast Crete before and after the eruption. Local taphonomy, which is not easily matched to the other sites on Crete, for example, Gournia, Mauclas, Papadiokombos, plays a substantial role in preservation. The additional evidence of tephra and pumice separating these features places the eruption well within the sequence. More analysis, however, via micromorphology is necessary to provide a more nuanced interpretation of the ash and pumice, and I think that's something we definitely want to do next summer. For now, I wanted to take a step back and see how the evidence from Chryssi can help us contextualize the deposits, other deposits in East Crete. And when we start, you look at the cup, that cup on the upper left-hand side is from Mauclas House C1. And I think these new deposits offer good parallels. And you see one from Irene Nikolakopoulos' study at House Delta at Akrotiri on the right. So there's a real link to those final LM1A deposits. And then a similar find was recently recovered by Vance Watrous at Gournia, and it's a pair of palatial foundation deposits. It's sort of southwest corner near the Betel at Gournia. The first of these deposits, you see on the lower right, was deposited in MM3A, and it's connected with the initial construction of the palace. A second deposit with many conical cups and pumice is associated with the rebuilding of the palace early in LM1B. Unfortunately, in their recent article in the Souls Festschrift, they really presentation of that. I think what the problem will be, it's mostly conical cups, and there's only so much you can do with an early 1B conical cup. It's not going to change the game that much. So I think what remains somewhat puzzling is the absence of more mature LM1A deposits in East Crete, and I'm not the first to draw attention to this. Finds from Palekastro, some recently published buildings 1 and 6, and others on the way, will partly fill this gap. However, recent presentations of MM3A to LM1A material from Mauclas by George Doudalis that'll soon be published, and Angus Smith's presentation from Gournia highlight the continued difficulties, this absence of more mature LM1A deposits. Neither presentation offered much for comparison. It seems fair to ask why. At Mauclas, the answer may simply be formation processes that largely remove these phases during the rebuilding after the eruption. A similar hypothesis has been offered by the excavators at Palekastro in a paper at the Cognac Cretological, and the authors of the recent publication of Building 6 at Palekastro. At Gourgnan, on the other hand, it may simply reflect the limited nature of the excavations. Earlier work at the site by Harriet Boyd uncovered a much larger section of the town. And restudy of her finds by several scholars, and this plan is from Colin and Jan's publication, The Troubled Island, drew attention to the fact that many of the houses in blocks C and D, here you see highlighted in that red box, were not rebuilt after LM1A destructions. The pottery from these houses illustrates the range of LM1A styles in East Crete, particularly the decorated closed vessels, and I've shown you a few of those on the right. Unfortunately, she doesn't illustrate a lot of cups for the period, so it wasn't a great way to look for parallels. Both Niemeyer and Warren have drawn attention to the fact that similar pottery was also recovered in the volcanic destruction levels of the houses at Akrotiri. And I want to thank Irene Nikolakopoulou for sending me this slide of some of the pottery from those levels that she's now studying from Block Delta. On the flip side, so there is some parallels for LM1A, but not a lot. On the flip side, work on early LM1B pottery began to gain traction after our LM1B pottery conference that Eric Halliger and I organized in 2007. And just to give you some indication of that, here I show you an early LM1B slide that Kelly Barnard did. Added white. So I think we're on the right track with this early 1B evidence. There are good parallels with the new early 1B finds at Chryssi, which are just the latest, I think, evidence for a growing body of evidence for this elusive post-eruption phase. And I think the other good parallels are Jerry Rutter's at Komos and Dario Pugliesi's at Ayatriada, but it's a hard phase to compare. And I think I was lucky after we had sort of studied this deposit, I was looking for parallels, particularly those ogivals that have the added white accents. And I still have the PowerPoint presentations from the LM1B pottery conference. So I go to Lefteri's Platons, and in fact, there are several good parallels for them in his deposits. And he had identified them as possible early LM1B deposits, and it had always pointed me in the direction of Zachros for parallels for the pottery. And I think now, during the pandemic, that's what I did, was study Chryssi pottery deposits. Zachros offers a lot of really interesting parallels for us, going all the way back to Middle Minoan 1B. But here in the early LM1B phase, I think Zachros has a lot to offer. And so in the search for more of these phases, I think that's the site that will offer parallels for. But anyway, we're looking forward to work like that. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Hello. All right. Okay. Thanks very much, Tom. No, fascinating paper. Can I just ask one couple of questions, because it was very striking what the continuation, if you like, from delicate spirals of LM1A, Popham's little spiral bench and the rest of it, seeming to go through the eruption, and afterwards there seemed to be absolute continuity in the pottery in many ways. I was wondering if there was continuity of fabrics. That was one question. Second was when you mentioned ogival cups occurring in the end of LM1A, I noticed you had no bases. There were only profiles, and they didn't look terribly ogival to me, and I thought it might be just what we call hemispherical bowls at Chronos.
Okay, so definitely there is continuity between these what I would call mature LM1A with the spirals, but those spirals go all the way through to the end, to the mature LM1B, and there were good parallels at Zachro. So yeah, there is some continuity. What changes? What struck me though were the differences. It's really the appearance of the shapes, the ogivals.
Yes,
come in with those monochrome ogivals. Yes. Those are true ogivals.
Yeah,
and there were plenty of them. And there were changes in the spirals. They were these parallel bands, these little wavy bands. They weren't all the exact, in much greater use of added white in a different way. So they were significant. I mean, that was on the semi-globulars as well. The fabrics, I would say, I wouldn't say I noticed a big change in fabric, but that would have been true all the way through. I don't think there was a big one there. Yeah.
Any questions from the floor? Charles at the back. Here's the microphone.
Hi Tom, thanks for a great talk. Lots of interesting things there, but I'm going to lower the tone a bit because I have a question about your conical cups. Firstly, no conical cups in your MM3B deposit. That's interesting. Is that functional, the size of the deposit? And secondly, I was interested by you were talking about how the range of types of the cups tightens was the phrase you used.
Yeah, I think it narrows it. Much less variation within a particular.
Would you say that's just production or functional? I mean, because I have this pattern at several sites that the planeware types decrease over time. And it's matched with an increase in decorative. So I'm kind of interested what you think about that.
Okay, so this is an observation that goes back to Moklas, where we have a local production center. So at Moklas, you get the emergence of the artisans' quarter in LM1B. And when Kelly Barnard and I looked at these kitchens houses, which went through LM1B back to the very beginning, the end of LM1A, we noticed a similar thing. The LM1A conical cups at Moklas showed much more variation in profile. The ogival cups, they only come at the very end. So let's stick with conicals. Much more variation in LM1A. LM1B, it narrows, and you get a preference for incurving rims. One of the big differences between conical cups in East Cretan sites and Central Cretan sites is the care that was taken to make them. The conical cups in East Crete show real care in LM1B, and it always, I think, was a challenge for people coming from Central Cretan sites when they would read our LM1B publications. They were looking for, struck them as the antithesis of what they were. And when I see conical cups at Knossos, I can't believe we're in the same universe. I mean, they're just so clumsily made, thick. I mean, they crank them out. So yeah, I think it has to do with workshops in some levels, but that's what's so interesting about Chrysi. So leave Moklas and come to Chrysi. Chrysi has no pottery production. It's all imported all the time. So, and one of the fun topics when you look at Chrysi pottery, it wasn't relevant to the paper today, is changes in the production centers. And while we always have a strong production coming from the North Central Crete, like Gornia producers, Priniaticos Pyrgos, we definitely see changes across the board from different producers, probably as well from Zakros, maybe some in the Miritos Valley. But yeah, I think there is it can't be associated with one production center. So it's got to be a more regional phenomenon, where in 1B we get more carefully, consistently made conical cups. And I think it's also true on bowls. One of the things I didn't bring up today was the rims of the semi-globular rounded cups and bowls have a groove in them. And it goes back to, in that case, to MM3B or something. But so does that help answer? I mean, a little bit. Yeah. In conical cups, I don't know what the answer, why they're not there, but I drew attention to it because I knew that would be a problem for some people who expect to see them in MM3B and such. Yeah. But I think you could see carefully. I mean, the conical cup base is so distinctive. It's easy to distinguish a straight-sided cup, which is a very thin wall, very different base from a conical cup, the straight-sided versus that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your paper. It's interesting that you really concentrate on the balls and the cups for this particular set, for this shapes, to do your analysis. I want to ask you, first of all, okay, I have many objections with the chronology, and for example, I would take the LM1A. I think there is an element of MM3B in your LM1A, and the LM1B, the LM1B. I think it is more, you need to convince us that it is early LM1B.
Yeah, I knew that's the hardest part. It's the ogivals for me. It's the ogivals. So it's
the ogival, they have so much variation, as Colin said.
Not in the LM1B, not in the early 1B.
You have hemispherical balls, the things that we call hemispherical balls, Knossos. You have bell-shaped cups. You have some bell-shaped cups that are raised with raised bases. that you
In the early 1B. No, I think in the early 1B, I think is,
So.
yeah.
Um,
So the pattern, so, yeah, okay, yeah.
The added white that you mentioned, having studied the acrotiri material, I mentioned that again because I studied all the imports from acrotiri from sector delta back in 2009 until 2011. And so at acrotiri, especially the imports at acrotiri, sector delta material, have a lot of added white, all the time you see added white in spirals, in the central knob of the spiral, in the central part, in this large black part, the center of the spiral, there is added flowers. There are added flowers also in the stems of the spiral. There is added white. So I would expect to have for the LM1A added white. For me, it's very important to have for the LM1A added white.
So the answer to that is we have plenty of added white in what I showed as LM1A. In the exact way you describe it, we have little dots in the dots on the solid centered spirals.
The early LM1B, the added white that you have.
But not what you described. It's different locations. It's slashes on the rim. It's over banding. It's not what you described. We don't have any solid centered spirals in what I showed you as early 1B. Those shapes, those semiglobular cups with the solid center spirals are part of our LM1A mature deposit. Some of those have the little added white dots in the location that you described in the center. Those are not part of what I described as early 1B. I did date them to LM1A mature. The solid center spirals on cups with dots are, I agree with you. They're mature LM1A. We have them. Yeah, but they don't appear in what I showed you as early 1B. Those are gone.
So, excuse me, do you have superimposed levels, layers
No.
of material?
So we do. So
you use typology. It is based on typology.
but that early, what I described as early 1B is on top of tephra. It's post-eruption. That was the beauty of it. Like that was the most important aspect of that. That deposit accumulates after the eruption. So I would call that, that's one of the factors from.
That is the thing. Sometimes the tephra, we also have tephra in our CC 10.6 basin deposit.
But the pumice wasn't the ash, it's in a different level. It's below.
There are many ways, you know that better. There are many ways to interpret the tephra.
Or LM1A. We find those in what I described as mature LM1A, and we have several of them. In the Valfio cups, lots.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And now we have a written question from Jerry Russo. Terrific paper, Tom. Clearest presentation of well-stratified and decorated small shapes from multiple LM1 phases that I've ever seen. The general development of LM1B early at Chryssi seems very similar to what one sees at Chronos. Can you comment on the possible distinction between foliate band and horizontal grass reed pattern, the first with leaves opening up to the left, the latter with leaves opening up to the right? And then we'll follow with Marita Mathari.
So the answer for Jerry, I'm glad he liked the early 1B phase. I thought he would. Is we don't have enough of them to really comment. I showed you the two that it's the one he's talking about. So the answer is no. I couldn't make a claim. We don't have enough to show it.
Okay, thanks. Now, Marita, your question, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ian, for such an interesting conference, and thank you, Tom, for your paper. Chryssi seems just a very interesting site, a key site concerning the synchronism with acrotiri destruction, volcanic destruction level. What I would like to stress is that every cup you've shown to us as late Minoan 1A mature, as you named them, or just late Minoan 1A, especially the fine ones, has more than 10 exact parallels in acrotiri volcanic destruction level. You've shown to us some of them from complex delta, but there are many other parallels, exact parallels, from both acrotiri and Raos. So I think what you've said to us is very useful, and this levels you have, late Minoan 1A, are exactly synchronous with the acrotiri volcanic destruction level. You've shown to us some earlier material. You've quoted Middle Minoan 3B, if I remember well, some caps. They find also parallels at acrotiri at the seismic volcanic level, just before the volcanic level, and they find also exact parallels. So it seems that the workshops which were in Eastern Crete imported material to acrotiri, and of course Chryssi will add quite a lot to this discussion about acrotiri and Eastern Crete and the imports from this side of Crete. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. I felt pretty good about the mature LM1A, what I called it. I think you're right. The parallels are pretty consistent. What's odd about it is you don't find as many examples of those shapes at other LM1A in East Cretan sites. They're just missing. I think we're just missing the levels. I think the shapes were there. We just don't get really good LM1A levels at a lot of sites. Yeah.
Thanks. I'll just go straight to a small comment from Yorgos Vouvalis. To add to Tom's comment, also in LM1A deposits from the ceremonial building B2 in Moklos, there is a great variation in conical cuts, which become standardized in LM1B. And then a comment from Tim Cunningham. Have you read it?
No.
No, right, okay, here we go.
It's too long.
I was wondering, considering that an eruption like that of Thera will put a lot of material into the air, tephra obviously, but also particles of soil, carbonized material, etc., and for an island eruption, a great deal of water. So when talking of ashfall, it is not necessarily dry like snow, but comes down as rain, like the mud rains we get on Crete nowadays. So how confident are you about distinguishing between the reworking by water that happens during the deposition of this material as it is falling versus some kind of pre-depositional reworking? And similarly, when deposits are said to contain low amounts of tephra, that is not the same thing as saying low amounts of ejecta. Are you distinguishing between these as well? Perhaps.
That's a really good question, Tim. And I think we're just at the beginning. Here's a disclosure. When Jan invited us to give this paper, we hadn't really studied these ash deposits. We were finding them over a large period of time. And initially we thought they were connected perhaps with purple production. There were large amounts of burned material. And so it's really been a sort of recent addition to the presentation. And I think we really have to wait for Takis Karkanis' discussion of it's he that sees water working in the micromorphological samples. I brought up the comment because Jan, in his review of the ash layers in his recent publication and the PK volume in building 6, which I think you were part of, talked a lot about water reworking the deposits. I was just sort of linking us to that broader discussion. I really don't have anything new and specific to say, but I think your observations are definitely valid. And then, the most challenging thing was the absence. I got to tell you, you hit the nail right on the head. The absence, these thick ash deposits that don't have lots of tephra particles in them were problematic. And I do not have an answer for that, and nor did Takis Karkanis or Georgia Tsortsidou. We were just grasping at straws talking about it. So we're just at the beginning. I think we have to retest them. We have a couple new deposits to test. But you're right. It needs a lot more thought to explain it. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. And now I call upon Irmgard Hein to give the paper on.
It's a break.
Oh, it's a break.